Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, again for being before us. I have a question for our PACOM commander, Admiral. Before I pose the question, I understand that countries like Vietnam are asking for closer military cooperation with the U.S. as a result of the East Sea maritime dispute. I know that you're the military guy, but you do sit in on the civilian side as policy is being made, and I would strongly urge you, along with the Department of Defense, to take Vietnam's human rights issues into consideration before committing to any maritime security package, because I believe that this country has been really terrible in its human rights issues. They continue to say they're going to do something, and then they just get worse. With that in mind, Admiral, can you provide this committee with your observations on the evolving security challenges presented by the ongoing maritime disputes in the East and South China Seas, and from a contingency standpoint, I mean, what would you consider would be our role if things begin to devolve and get out of hand with respect to those disputes?
Thank you. And first, I would very much take your comments and counsel on the human rights. We track very closely with State Department. We follow their lead to ensure that, and Department of Justice ensure that we're within the boundaries of what's legal to be able to do, and we're very sensitive to that because, for all the right reasons. If you take a look at the territorial disputes, you ask yourself, how did this all happen in this generation? Well, why has it just now popped up? Well, in reality, they've been around for a long time, but there haven't been much motivation to have to deal with them. There was plenty of fish, resources, energy resources weren't that important. China was not on the rise that it is today. And we didn't have, until the 80s, which we're not a signatory to, we didn't have the UN Law of the Sea Convention, which defined how you would lay out what belongs to you in your EEZs, your economic zones. So all that culminated in this century with now everybody, all these nations taking a look at, well, how do I ensure that for my sovereignty that I have access to these in the way that I see them? So in the East China Sea, in the north, there over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, there's the issue between China and Japan that you're all very familiar with. In that case, I think we made it clear the role of the U.S. in the alliance with Japan, and that those islands fall within what we consider mutual defense treaty boundaries, and that's been stated widely by the Secretary of State, and so that's kind of the policy there. How that will play out in the long run between the Chinese and Japanese would be speculation. But at this stage, we're watching it very carefully. In the South China Sea, if you take a look at all the overlapping claims, it looks it's like chicken soup. I mean, it's so complex of who would own what. And so there's really, in my view, the only way forward is for them to use the international law, international tribunals to be able to come to agreement, and we've seen successes of that throughout the AOR, where countries come together, they get a tribunal to be able to look at it, and then they accept that. What's complicated, though, I think, is the perspective that the PRC or China has on their claims and the way that they're approaching those. First, they take a historic view of the South China Sea, and they have what I think is a loosely defined historic 9-dash line, which basically gives them the entire fishing rights and mineral rights and EEZ rights to the South China Sea. And this is in direct conflict with many of their neighbors who have similar claims and are looking to protect them. There's the PRC, or China, has also done things, I think, that exacerbated the situation by establishment of an air defense zone in the East China Sea, and you understand what the U.S. position is on that. So the way ahead here is first of all, I think that the role of an ASEAN is important. That the 10 nations of ASEAN who have equities, particularly in this part of the world, have got to be supported, and they need to come together and to have a voice on how these things are dealt with, in particular as it relates to how they deal with China. They very much need to go forward quickly on a code of conduct that China needs to agree with to prevent miscalculation in the South China Sea. Our role on it is, number one, is to be able to sense and understand what's going on. So ISR assets are very important to me in that part of the world. And then for us to be able to share information where necessary with our allies and with our partners so that there's a common understanding of what's actually happening in there. But in the end, these things will need to be solved through arbitration, through legal means, through international forums, and not through coercion, which we, as a U.S. policy, do not support coercive behavior to get to your claims by any claimant.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr.
I appreciate
Wilson.
it.